Chapter 14. Ascelina. I was puzzled by the structure of Estolia from the very beginning. My father made certain that I mingled with the most elevated of society while I was still in England, and the skills that he taught me came in quite useful once I was living in Estolia. But I was still confused by some of the events that took place. I recall how proud the king was when he announced that his youngest daughter would be marrying the man who cared for the massive pond and fountain in front of the palace, and who directed the efforts of half a dozen other workers in keeping the beautiful grounds well groomed. I could think of no other nation where a princess might marry a gardener or groundskeeper and have this illicit joy and happiness in all who heard of the forthcoming nuptials. Estolia had a way of turning most of my preconceptions back in on themselves. Charlotte Zakarian, Ensayo 85. Esteban's first reaction to Zakarian's statement was a tightening of his lips and a narrowing of his eyes. Though he did not relax, his voice had a superficial joviality when he said, "But of course, after your injury, it is only natural that you would wish to be assured of her safety and health. I shall require her to thank you, and to set your mind at ease prior to your return to your ship." When she approached, Zakarian got to his feet. She walked slowly, hesitantly, warily. He had to blink several times as his vision kept blurring. She came to a halt a step behind the other man, and waited. Next to him, Omador's stance and voice were formal. "Allow me the pleasure of introducing my older brother. Zakarian, firstborn son of Zacharias and Estoliana." Zakarian couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Her hair was still wet, but she had changed out of her wet dress. When Esteban swept his flamboyant, feather-bedecked hat off his head, she jerked away from him, like a poorly broken horse shying away from an upraised hand. With a bow, the other man said, "I am Esteban, only son of Madrigal, de Palmara. This is Ascelina, my bride-to-be. This is our matrimonial cruise. Thanks to your swift action, the ceremony to make her mine will go forward as planned." Before Zakarian could formally greet the woman, another man stepped forward, standing between Zakarian and the lovely Ascelina. He was dressed in dark tunic and breeches. In addition to the sword in a scabbard, he had 2 leather straps crossing his chest, and each one sported a well-worn sheath with a dagger. Both straps and sheaths showed a significant amount of wear. He also had what Antony described as nervous fingers, always active, the sign of a man who was expert in the use of his preferred weapons. Unlike Esteban, whose sword and scabbard looked ornamental, this man was proficient. "This is Petros. He has many talents, he will perform the nuptial ceremony." Zakarian ignored the introduction. "Ascelina has no intention of being your mate, she has told you this. As a gentleman, you must honor her wishes." He spoke with certainty, seeing confirmation in the way her eyes widened. Esteban's amiable expression was wiped off his face, and his jaw jutted angrily. "You are as nothing." He lifted one wrist and flicked an invisible speck off the sleeve of his overtunic. His voice conveyed equal parts amusement and disdain. "As is your opinion on the topics of honor and gentlemanly behavior." A smirk lifted one corner of his mouth. "It would seem that you have overstayed your welcome here upon my vessel." Zakarian moved so swiftly, Esteban did not react in time to stop him. He crossed the distance that separated them, and pulled Ascelina away from the other man, thrusting her into his brother's arms. He did not have time to marvel at the sensations rushing through his system at her magical touch. His focus was on the man bristling at him, his expression ugly, feral. His tone was fierce when he said, "Ascelina will come with us." Esteban's hand settled on the hilt of his sword, and he growled dissent, saying, "I think not. If you do not leave my ship, I shall have you and your brother thrown over the side and fed to the beasts of the sea." Zakarian slid in front of Ascelina. His brother would support him. Esteban, with his brightly dyed clothing and painted face, was the type of man who hired others for the skills they themselves were too lazy to master. His hands were soft, with no calluses of honest toil. Zakarian would defeat Esteban if he was fool enough to draw his sword. He remained alert. Petros, the man at Esteban's side, was not a man to ignore. There were only 4 other men on the deck, and the small sailboat could not boast more than 4 or 5 additional men. The Dia de Promesa, by contrast, was more than twice the size of this ship, and had at least 3 times the number of men. "We are leaving," he said. He half turned and gestured to the lovely woman that she should precede him to the planks that had been used as a hasty method of moving from one ship to the other. The sound of Esteban pulling his sword out of its scabbard was loud, echoing across the water. By the time Zakarian turned back, the sound was followed by the sailors of both ships all pulling their swords. He focused on Esteban and said, his voice soft, "You would not prevail. You and your men would be slaughtered." The honking of a few willow-owls flying overhead seemed to break up the tableau, and at a gesture, the other man slid his sword back into its scabbard, with his men following his example. Amador gestured towards their ship, and 4 of their sailors crossed over to escort Ascelina to their ship. When Zakarian was the only Estolian left on the Palmaran ship, Esteban's voice rang out, "That one has been harlot to half the sailors in Palmara. She will deceive you like she deceived me." Zakarian's rebuttal was swift. "First she was your betrothed, and then she was a harlot. Either you are a fool, planning to marry a harlot, or you, sir, are a liar, unable to speak only truth. I am no fool, and I know better than to accept the word of either fool or liar." He turned his back on the flamboyant man, leaping up to balance on the plank. Ascelina's high-pitched scream was his only warning, and he instinctively turned back. The knife that Petros threw, aimed at his back, missed its target, lodging in his left upper arm. He grabbed his arm and toppled the rest of the way onto the deck of the Dia de Promesa. The wind, breathless half an hour before, chose that moment to rise. The Estolian sailors had already raised the anchor, and with the return of the wind, their boat pulled away from the other ship. Zakarian staggered to the central mast and gripped it with his left hand. He reached for the dagger but was stopped by an authoritative voice. "Don't." It was Ascelina speaking. Petros threw the knife. He boasts that his daggers nearly always take the life of the man they touch. He stores them in oil of pigweed seeds. The wound will not heal. Amador stepped close, his hands clasped. "What is to be done then?" She came over to where Zakarian was slowly sinking down to the deck, his back supported by the mast. She reached down and tore a strip of fabric from her skirt, saying, "The Ascelino," she waved to the recent catch of Anchoina, "I need a fillet of the flesh, of this size." She demonstrated the size she wanted with her hands. She added something else that did not translate well. Rather than try to explain, she merely went to the nearest fish and then held her hand out to Amador, who gave her a blade. She gutted the fish, carving a fillet and pulling some obscure organ from within the body cavity. Once back at his side, she pulled a small glass vial from between her breasts. It hung on a slender chain. It is a miracle that there are the ingredients for the remedy all here upon the ship. Seawater, this substance, and the flesh of Anchoina. Is not seawater full of contaminants? Amador asked her. The salt neutralizes the evil essence of pigweed, she said. Zakarian watched the discussion between Ascelina and Amador and felt the warm, comforting embrace of deity. He would survive. There was no other possibility when deity promised them prosperity. He studied the shifting glow surrounding her while Amador explained to her the soaps of cleanliness. When she pulled the dagger from his arm, he bellowed at the sudden agony rushing from the injury to his fingertips as the air interacted with the poison. Nor could he contain the sigh of bliss as the flesh of the fish soothed the pain. "The ship from Palmara matches us," Markan said to them. Amador took charge, in a way that Zakarian recognized would be typical throughout their reign. They cannot thread the needle without coming to grief. He was referring to the hazardous inlet to the inner bays. Even if he does not damage his ship in the exchange inlet, he'll invariably choose Graveyard Bay. It is to be hoped that his men will recognize the danger and take him away from our shores. He will not give up. Ascelina looked up from where she was working on binding his wound. Markan did not sound disturbed at her assertion. He cannot catch us, his ship is no match for ours. Have no fear, princess, that he will reclaim you. For Zakarian there was something significant in Markan calling her princess, but before he could figure it out, he had to close his eyes as the world began to whirl around him.